The boy went off the harbour wall on an ordinary ugly morning, into water the colour of old pewter, and the dog went over after him before anyone on the Staithe had finished drawing breath to shout. 140 pounds of Newfoundland, coal-black but for one white blaze at the chest, cleared the wall like a barrel going over, struck the sea flat and was swimming before the spray came down. The chop was short and vicious, water that slaps a child's face at every stroke and fills his mouth when he cries, and the boy, Charlie, 9, a fisherman's son walking the icy coping on a dare, was going under the second time when the great head reached him. The dog took the shoulder of the boy's jacket in his teeth, came about in the water, and towed him in through the chop, head high, working. It was competence almost frightening to see, 4 years of training in it, and the crowd had barely found its voice. By the time the dog's feet found the shingle, half the village was running, men coming down the wall steps 2 at a time, a woman screaming Charlie's name with the fright that arrives only after the danger has gone. The dog towed the boy the last yard into reaching hands, stood while Charlie was snatched up and wept over, and shook himself once, hugely, a bright storm of spray in the winter light. And then he walked away from all of it. The crowd was cheering him. Fishermen who had known him all his life shouted his praise, and a dozen hands reached for him as he passed. He walked past everyone, deaf to the lot, a worker going home past strangers, up the shingle to a tall woman standing alone at the crowd's edge in a cloak of deep coral wool. She had come running like the rest and stopped, and stood very still, younger than her stillness suggested, strong through the shoulders, heavy tawny gold hair loose in the wind, a face made for laughing that looked 3 years out of practice. The dog sat down in front of her, streaming, and looked up. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the cheering faltered and the crowd's attention swung round to her. She put one hand on the wet dome of his head. "You were told to be finished," she whispered. On the wall above them stood a stranger, the wind pulling at a caped greatcoat that had cost more than any boat in the harbour. Very tall, black-haired, a still listening face, come to Marram Staithe that morning on a matter of guns and rope. He heard what the woman whispered, and would think about it, on and off, for the rest of his life. They put Charlie by Mrs. Utting's fire, her Net-Loft standing nearest the wall, and she ordering blankets before he was up the steps. She was a small, spare widow, mere black hair gone iron under her cap, quick dark eyes, and on her way in she paused at the door to address the sea, as one speaks to a difficult neighbour. "None of that now," she told it. "We have company." The company was the stranger, who had carried the boy's dry boots up from the wall, and was therefore, by the law of Net-Lofts, owed tea. He gave his name quietly, Ludovic, Duke of Blakeney, 36, his seat a half-day inland. The loft absorbed this with Norfolk composure, and went on rubbing the boy's feet. It was Mrs. Utting, pouring, who answered the question the Duke was too well-mannered to ask about the dog. "That's Neptune," she said. "Titus Cubitt's dog, that was. Had him from a puppy and trained him to the lines. Carried rope to wrecks through surf a boat couldn't live in, and him not 4-year-old. Then the Speedwell went on to the bar, 3 winters back, and Titus drowned bringing off a gentleman. Begging your pardon, sir, for they say he was some great man's brother. Drowned saving him, and the both of them lost. And the dog swam and swam that night and lost his man. And Avis, that's the widow that you saw, she retired him after. Says he has done his share. And who is to say she is wrong?" The door had opened while she spoke. The woman in the coral cloak stood in it, come to fetch the dry boy home, the wet dog a black shadow at her knee. Whatever she had heard of the telling, she took Charlie's hand, thanked the room in 5 words, and left. That was the village's story of the Speedwell Night, and it told it easily, as it told the weather. Avis Cubitt had her own, and had told it to nobody in 3 years, and the village had stopped noticing there was anything left untold. The gun came a week later, by wagon, and the Staithe turned out entire, a squat brass mortar on a timber bed. Captain Manby's line-throwing mortar, which the Staithe would call the gun and never call anything else. Crates of cordage, ollards faking frames, shallow wooden trays with pins in rows for the line to lie in ordered turns, and riding the wagon's tail, nursing the load over every rut, a compact ruddy man in an immaculate coat, iron grey, with powder-burnt hands. Sergeant Ollard, late of the Royal Artillery, who permitted the village to look at the gun for exactly as long as it took to unload it. "New, is she?" asked a boatman, into the general inspection. "Manby pattern, 1808, said Ollard, laying one finger on the Board of Ordnance mark, and the date stamped in the brass. "Cast the same year I watched Captain Manby take the crew of the brig Elizabeth off Yarmouth Bar. February of the year 8 winters gone, and 7 men came ashore dry-shod, near enough, who would have drowned within hail of their own church. I have been of one opinion about this gun ever since." The Duke of Blakeney stood on an upturned fish-box to address the Staithe. It was the first Duke's speech most of them had heard, and shorter than they expected. "You know what wrecks cost this coast better than I do," he said. "This gun throws a light shot line to a stranded ship. Her crew bend a hauling line to it and draw that out. And by the hauling line they draw out the hawser, a rope thick as your wrist, and make it fast aloft. And then the people ride the hawser ashore in a rescue cot, one at a time, over the top of the surf." "And who hauls the hawser out?" said a boatman from the back. "The wrecked men themselves, with the shot line the gun has given them. That is the whole machine. The nearest lifeboat lies at Cromer, beyond the point, and in the weather that kills it might as well lie in France. I mean this parish to have its own answer. No man on this coast will ever again swim a rope out to a wreck. Then, 1 degree too honest for company. I have put guns on 3 coasts these 3 years. I have never yet stood on this one when it mattered. I mean to change that also." The Staithe gave him the silence that in Norfolk stands for applause. Mrs. Utting, at the back, looked from the Duke's still face to the sea, and told it privately that it had been warned. He wanted shore crews, and every man on the beach, asked who best understood the working of lines to a wreck, gave the same answer twice. The first was Titus Cubitt with a slow look at the churchyard. The second came sideways, from men handing over something they had half forgotten they held. "There's his widow," said an old boatman at last. "She worked the shore end beside him 7 year. But you'll want a man, I suppose." The Duke walked up to the cottage that afternoon. It was small and scoured and tidy. Nets hung to mend under the eaves, and at the gable end the wash-house window propped on its peg in a wind that would have shut anybody else's, that window being the dog's own door in every weather. The woman who opened the door to him had rope in her hands and a black dog at her hip, and gave him precisely the deference she gave the weather. "Mrs. Cubitt," he said, "I am putting a line-throwing gun on this beach, and crews to serve it. Every man on the Staithe tells me the person who best understands the working of lines to a wreck lived in this house, and that you worked the shore end 7 years. I did. Then I am asking your eye on my crews. Name your terms." "My terms?" She turned the splice once. "Has any man on that beach told you what the shore end is, your grace? Or has it been all guns and yardage since you came?" "Guns and yardage, mostly." She heard him out with her eyes on the splice, and then said the first of the things he never afterwards forgot. "A line has 2 ends, your grace. The wet end is carried by the bravest thing on this beach. The shore end does the drowning." She tied off the splice. "Your gun can throw the wet end. Nobody in your wagons knows anything about the other. That is what you are asking me for, whether you know it or not." "Then that is what I am asking for," said the Duke. "I'll think on it," said Avis Cubitt, and shut the door, courteously and completely, on a man who owned 11,000 acres. The wreck bell rang 4 days after, in the black end of a falling tide, a brig in trouble off the bar, showing lights. She clawed off on the flood 2 hours later, whole and lucky. A false alarm, as the village counted them. The dog counted differently. At the first stroke of the bell, in the cottage at the top of the shingle, Neptune rose from the hearth, took the old harness of leather and brass down from its peg by the door, and dragged it by one strap to Avis's feet. He stood over it, ears up, waiting, as he had at every bell of 3 working winters. The bell had been his summons before it was the village's. "Not you," Avis said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he lay down where he was, his head on his paws and his body across the harness, and stayed so while the bell went on ringing. The Duke saw it. He had come up the shingle to ask the widow's eye on the brig's lights, and the door stood open on the firelight, and he saw the whole exchange, the drag, the waiting, the 2 words, the lying down. He swallowed the question of the moment and walked back to the beach carrying a larger one he could find no polite shape for. The gun had come to Marram Staithe knowing everything about rope and range and powder. What did the dog know that the gun did not? What the village knew of Avis Cubitt could be told over one mending of a net. 32. Married at 21 to a man the coast trusted. Widowed at 29, stayed. She gutted and packed at the fish house for day wages, mended nets at her own door, and fed a dog the size of a yearling calf on wages that would have pinched around a spaniel. And everyone knew that on bad weeks the dog ate before she did. Her years with Titus had been good ones, and she would have corrected anyone who said otherwise, warmly and at once. 7 years of real work in real weather, beside a man who laughed easily and taught her everything he knew. What grief had taken was the rest of it. The village remembered Titus's widow. It had quietly forgotten the woman who stood at the shore end 7 winters running, whose hands knew the buckles, the laid line, the weight of a man riding rope through surf. The forgetting was tender, and that was the worst of it. The kindness had the shape of a shrine. The faithful widow, faithful still, his dog warm by her fire, and tenderness of that shape is a wall a woman can live behind till she dies, and be praised every day for the living. The fish house said it daily, over the gutting boards. 3 winters, and she feeds that great dog like a Christian. Faithful as the tide, that one. And the old boatman at her own door. Titus's dog is in good hands, missus. He'd rest easy knowing. She thanked them every time, and carried the thanks home like wet sand. She fed the dog, and the dog grew old, and the village called it faithfulness, and only the dog himself went on arguing. His share was never hers to set. And there stood the village, calling the dog finished and the widow faithful for it, with the plain thing unsaid among them. The ones who love the work must be asked what is left in them, not told. It would take 1 more winter, a Dutch brig and a duke's grief to teach her, and she would learn it out loud, in front of everyone. The Duke sent word, in the 2nd week, that he would call on the Thursday to speak of shore crews properly, and on the Wednesday evening, for reasons she did not examine, Avis Cubitt set about tidying her life. It was a small life, and soon tidied, until she came to the coat. Titus's had hung on its hook by the door for 3 winters. A boatman's coat, salt stiff, the shape of his shoulders still in it. She stood before it a while, then lifted it down, folded it, laid it in the chest under the window, and went on with her evening. Neptune checked the hook before supper. He stood beneath it, nose up, reading the empty air where the coat had hung every day of his life, and turned away. He was quiet about it, without whining, without collapse. He simply checked, as he checked the harness's peg, as he had once checked a tide line for his man. He checked it at dusk, and when she banked the fire, and again in the dark, so that she lay listening to his claws crossing to the door, standing, crossing back. In the morning she took the coat out of the chest, shook out the folds, and hung it on its hook again. Moving on does not require lying to the dog about what used to live there, she said to him. He was watching her hands, and when the coat was up he pressed his head against her hip and went to the hearth and lay down, and was asleep before she had the kettle on. She knew exactly what the dog remembered, and had better reasons for knowing than the village ever guessed, and she stood a moment with her hand flat on the coat before she began the day. The Thursday meeting became a fortnight of drills because she had answered the Duke at her own door with one condition. "I'll show your crews what they're for. The dog comes to the flat water drills, so your men know what a line dog was. He does no work." So on a still bright morning between weathers, the crews assembled on the hard sand at low water, and Neptune walked among them with his tail swinging, monumentally pleased, stealing bread from coat pockets with the delicacy of a pickpocket. Retired he was. Idle he had never been. He swam most mornings of his life for his own reasons, and there was no rust in him, deep through the chest and sound in wind and limb. At the noon rest, Charlie threw a rope's end into the shallows, and he fetched it and dropped it and stood waiting, and the word that sent him out for it was, "Again." The Duke watched Avis run the crews through the dry work, the faking of the shot line, which is laying it in long, loose folds in its frame so it can run without knotting, the reeving of the endless hauling line, the order of a haul, and understood within the hour what the fish house had hidden. The trouble came at noon, and it came from goodwill. Sergeant Ollard, who had taken to the dog as old soldiers will, wanted the new men to see a demonstration haul on flat water, 50 easy yards to a moored boat. Avis was up the beach at the frames. The dog stood at the water's edge beside Ollard with the toggle in his mouth, a smooth wooden peg on a leather becket, spliced to the shot line's end, shaped for a dog's jaw. Titus Cubitt had never made a working line fast to his dog. The harness was for handling and for hauling out, and nothing carried in the teeth is a thing a dog cannot put down. "Go," said Sergeant Ollard. Neptune stood still and looked down the beach at Avis. "Ollard, no fool," said it once more, kindly, and the dog did not shift his weight. He stood with the toggle in his mouth and his eyes on the woman by the faking frames, and the drill stood becalmed around one syllable until Avis walked down the sand and took the toggle out of his mouth. "That word isn't yours," she said. "Whose is it?" asked Ollard. She coiled the shot line with 3 turns of her wrist, gave it back to the sergeant, brought the dog to heel with a touch on her thigh, and walked home, leaving the question standing on the beach all day and longer. And the Duke added it to the one he already carried, and found the 2 had the same shape. The drills went on, and the Duke began to talk with her. 3 times that fortnight they fell into conversation of real length, and the dog started every one. The first came at the noon rest, when Neptune crossed to the Duke's crate and lay down across his boots, the full weight, and the Duke, pinned, had to make conversation or study the horizon. "Is this usual?" "It is a habit," said Avis. "My husband used to sit on that crate at the noon rest. The dog slept on his boots from a puppy. You chose the crate. I'll surrender it. You will not shift him now for love or bread. You may as well be comfortable." She sat down on the faking frame across from him, and after a moment she said, "You may also ask what you have been circling for a fortnight, Your Grace. You have the face of a man deciding whether a question is rude. Most of my questions are rude. I have been 3 years asking coastal villages about their wrecks." He looked out at the bar. "Does it ever leave you, the particular one, or does it only change its manner of arriving?" "It changes its manner of arriving," said Avis. He nodded slowly and let it rest, and the second conversation and the third went the same wandering road on other days, winters, cargoes, what the sea leaves ashore, and each ended about something neither had named. The Duke's brother was in all 3 and named in none. Avis noticed and said nothing, being herself a person with an unnamed thing at the center of every conversation she had. It was at the 3rd drill that the dog invented his post. The tide had chased the crews up the beach, and the Duke and Avis stood over the day's tally, she explaining, with both hands, what his second crew captain had done wrong with a fouled laid line. He leaning in to follow it, the two of them nearer than either had yet noticed. Neptune had been swimming in the drill surf on his own account. He came up the shingle at a wet amble, walked in under the Duke's elbow and put himself between them, broadside on, 140 pounds of soaked authority. Then he shook. The spray went up in a burst of sea. The Duke took the worst of it full in the waistcoat, stood a moment in dripping silence, and looked down at the animal now sitting contentedly on his boots. "Your dog has views," he said. "He has a post," said Avis, wiping her face with her wrist. "He did not resign it when I retired him." It became a fixture of the drills. Whenever the Duke and the widow stood too long or too near, the black shape arrived, damp or dry as the day provided, and took the space between them with parochial gravity. "I have begun carrying bread in my left pocket," the Duke admitted. "The third time it happened. For him? For the corruption of officials." "You are wasting good bread," said Avis. "My officials take the bribe and enforce the regulation regardless. He has been paid off by every man on this crew, and here he sits." "Well fed," said Avis. "A professional," said the Duke with respect. They were, both of them, laughing by then, and neither had noticed the other noticing it. The Duke's public demonstration was announced for the Saturday, and he wagered on it, openly on the beach, before the assembled Staithe. "There stands the old wreck post," he said, 300 yards on the bar. "If my gun cannot lay a line across it before your eyes, I double the drill wages Monday, and we begin again from the first page. If it can, you will allow the thing is worth your son's learning. Either road, you will have been entertained." He said it to give the village a reason to come, and the village came. The gun spoke handsomely. The line rose in a long climbing arc, every neck on the beach tilting after it, and fell into the sea 30 yards short of the post. The silence that followed was the politest sound the Duke had ever heard, and the cruelest. Norfolk does its scorn quietly, in the set of shoulders turning for home. "Yards, Sergeant," said the Duke. 270, Your Grace, against a beach wind," said Ollard, unmoved, already at the breach. "She'll throw 350 and better on a still day with dry cordage. A wet line is a heavy line. Every fathom of water she drags adds to the load, and the wind was eating the rest. Range is the first lie this service tells you, and I'd sooner the village learned it on a post than on a ship's company." The Duke stood a moment with his lost wager, then turned to the beach and paid it in full and out loud. Wages doubled from Monday. Training begun again from the first page, his own attendance at every drill. "Dry cordage Monday, missus?" a crewman asked Avis, going up the beach. "Dry cordage," she said, "and new frames." It bought him more than the shot would have. The Staithe had watched gentry win things all their lives. Watching one lose properly and pay properly and come back Monday in the rain was novel. "He paid up smiling," said an old boatman, rendering the parish verdict. "I have known men take a herring harder than that man took a beach full of witnesses." She taught the hall that fortnight, over real rope, to men who wrote her words on the backs of tide tables in carpenter's pencil. Slack is his. Tension is yours. The moment you cannot tell whose it is the sea's, and you haul. Slack is his, the crew said back, ragged. Tension is ours. Once more, and believe it, a man's life will hang on whether your hands know it asleep. Slack is his. Tension is ours. When we cannot tell, we haul. She walked the line of them with the rope running through her own hands and corrected each grip in turn, and the drilled men stood to it. To the Duke, hauling in his shirt sleeves at number 3 and obeying her with a thoroughness that scandalized his own coachman, she gave the second law on a day the surf was up. "Watch his ears, not the water. The sea lies all day. His ears have never learned how." She said it with her eyes on Neptune, who lay up the beach beside the faking frames, ears turning to follow every gull, every voice, every shift of wind. And that is why a dog at all, the Duke said slowly, a man arriving somewhere. The gun cannot judge, the line cannot judge. The gun is a strong arm with no eyes, said Avis. The dog is eyes and judgment, and 40 generations of bred sense about water, swimming your line for you. My husband used to say the mortar and the dog would end as one service, each doing what the other could not. He said it to anyone who would listen. Mostly that was me. Manby's mortar was official. There were patterns and plates and a board behind it. Cubitt's dog work was his own, and Ollard had never seen the two services joined anywhere else. You do not send a dog into the sea, said Avis. You come to an agreement about it. That is the entire craft, Your Grace, and my husband was the finest man at it that ever lived, and it cannot be printed. He took the point better than she expected, and pressed past it to where his mind had already travelled. A line reaching a wreck is not the same as the people aboard knowing what to do with it. That is the gap in my machine, and it costs me sleep. A crew that has never seen the apparatus must rig the tail block from a printed card, in a gale, in the dark. Then we print instructions, said Ollard from the breach. In English, said Avis. The answer was silence. The sea off that bar spoke 6 languages in an ordinary winter, and the printed card spoke 1. The question went into the Duke's notebook and stood there a month. And when the answer came, it came in 2 parts, and neither was English. Deep winter set in and stayed. The drills went on in weather that turned the ropes to iron, and the crews stood to them, doubled wages having become pride of service somewhere in the 3rd week, and men who 6 weeks ago could not reeve a hauling line argued tail-block rigging over their beer, with diagrams in spilled porter. You have rigged it to the shrouds, you turnip, one was heard to tell his own brother, with feeling. The shrouds are gone in your weather. It goes to the mast stump. The brother conceded the mast stump. The Duke was on the beach for all of it, his coats salt-stained and his hands rope-hard, and the Staithe, which had begun by calling him Your Grace with the accent on the joke, arrived by degrees at calling him Your Grace with the accent on the man. He and the widow ran the winter shore between them, and were spoken of in the fish-house in one breath, and went on as they were, because each was carrying something the other had not been told. It was in those weeks that Avis and Ollard answered her own question. They took a plank of deal, and the sergeant drew on it in his exact artillery hand while she corrected him, and it was varnished 3 times against the sea. Not one word on it. 6 numbered pictures, and no more. The mast stump, the tail block made fast to it, the hauling line rove through, the hawser coming aboard, the cot travelling with a man in it, a hand giving 2 pulls. Ollard bent it onto the shot line to go out behind the block, fought it beneath the Royal Artillery, and never left it off the wagon. The harness hum oiled on its peg, and the sea lay offshore through the short days and shone, doing what it does between cruelties. The second bell came in weather, at the dying end of a January afternoon, a Collier out of Lynn, deep laden, driven onto the outer bar with her fore-topmast gone, and the sea getting up behind a rising gale. In the cottage, Neptune had the harness at the door before the bell's 3rd stroke. He dragged it to her feet and stood over it, and this time, when she said, "Not you," he stayed standing a long breath, and another, his eyes on her, before he lay down upon it. The lying down had grown slower. She noticed, and carried the noticing down the shingle, and it sat in her boot the whole way, because the gun was already going out. It was the new gun's first true service. The first shot fell close across the Collier's bow, tantalizing, lost overboard in the smother. The second dropped the shot line clean over the waist of the ship, and a cheer went up that the gale flattened to nothing. Then the real work began, the work Avis had drilled into them. The hauling line out, the hawser swayed after it, the tail block rigged by freezing Lynn colliers who had never seen one, and the cot sent travelling, and the shore crew hauling to her count. Haul, haul, handsomely, sea coming, hold, hold, now haul, haul, haul. Her voice pitched in the carrying place under the gale's register that Titus had taught her, and the crew's backs moved as one, the Duke at number 3 with the rope tearing his gloves and her count in his spine. "Man in the cot!" the cry came down the beach. "Haul away! Steady! Haul!" 4 men came ashore alive, wet and frozen and full of the sea, swung in over the surf one at a time to be caught and carried, and the beach worked around them in a strung-out line of hands, blankets and Mrs. Utting. The 5th man was on the rope when the sea took its fee. A parted strand somewhere out in the dark water. The line went slack with a horrible ease, and the man went into the surf 50 yards out. "Yawl!" Avis's voice cut the length of the beach. "He swims. Get off now." The yawl got him, half drowned, blue as slate, breathing. And in the last of the hauling, a green sea caught the shore crew and drove a boatman named Dunning over the faking frames, breaking his arm against the gunbed. 5 saved, and the Collier's master off at the flood by his own boat, and the village called it a victory, and it was won. But Avis stood at the tide line after with the parted line's end in her hand, reading the frayed strand in the lantern light. The machine was real, and the machine was magnificent, and the machine, twice now in her life, had been within 1 strand, 1 flinch, 1 freezing minute, of a different arithmetic altogether. They set Dunning's arm in Mrs. Utting's Net-Loft, because it was nearest, and it took 3 of them. Mrs. Utting to splint, Dunning to swear, and Avis to hold the traction, while the Duke, who had carried the man up the shingle on his back, was pressed into holding the lamp, and then, when the splinting wanted a 4th hand, the knot. "Begging pardon for the language, Your Grace," said Dunning between instalments of it. "He does the same over a splinter," said Mrs. Utting. "Pull, girl, he'll mend crooked out of spite else." "Spend what you like," said the Duke. "I heard better from the sergeant when the powder wet." "You did not," said Ollard from the door. "There is no better. There is only louder." So her hands and his were on the same length of bandage, in a small, warm room, over a hurt man. The knot was tied, and their hands stayed a moment longer than the work required, his fingers and hers on the linen, the lamp hissing, and she looked up and found the Duke looking at her, and the room had grown very small. It was Avis who stood first. She found the kettle an urgent matter, and told herself the truth over it in the flat voice she saved for truths. A fish-house widow noticed by a duke has no net under her. She had built 3 years of standing on this shore out of being past all such notice, and the standing was warm and safe, and every day it fitted her a little worse. The Duke walked home along the tide line in the dark, being 3 years out of the habit of hoping. It was that week, over the drying gear in the gun shed, that he said his creed aloud to the apparatus, with a warmth very near tenderness. Perfect this, and it never happens again. Perfect the apparatus, and no man need ever swim, and no man need ever be brave. Courage is the ration you issue when the equipment has failed. I mean to make it obsolete on this shore. Avis, in the door of the shed with a coil on her shoulder, heard it all and let it stand. There was a true answer. She was the only living person who owned it, and it was beyond her strength to pay. She put the coil on its peg and went home to her dog. The shore crew business gave the Duke reasons to call at the cottage, and the winter gave the reasons cover. There were rosters to settle, gear to argue over, a plan of the bar to correct in her hand, his chart being 11 years old, and the bar having moved twice. Your chart has men walking dry where I have seen a brig break up. Then draw me a better one. I am drawing it. Stop leaning on the wet ink. He came up the shingle path once a week, then twice, sat at her table with his greatcoat steaming on the chair back, drank her tea, which was thin, and praised it, which was outrageous, and she let him do both. Neptune conducted these visits by his own protocol, met the Duke at the gate, escorted him up the path with an air of arrest, inspected the greatcoat's pockets, and then, the business of the table being talked over his head, arranged himself across the Duke's boots and slept, the full weight, settled with a sigh. "He appears diplomatically flexible," said the Duke, the first time it was done to him, having lost all feeling in his feet and resolved to die rather than move them. Charlie came too, most weeks, on errands his mother could not afterwards remember issuing. He came to see the dog, and got 10-minute lessons at the door for it. Coil against the lay, Charlie. Other hand. Why? So she runs clear when she's called for. So she runs clear. Now look at the old dog, and tell me what his ears are doing. Nothing, missus, he's asleep. His left ear turned when the cart came round the fish house, before ever you heard it. Asleep is a word we use for dogs because we are not paying attention. He referred to Neptune, always, reverently, as the old dog, because that was what the village called him. The old dog, the widow's old dog, kindly meant every word of it, and every word laying another stone on the wall. The village had begun to notice the Duke's boots under the widow's table, and its noticing was gentle, and it was terrible. Mrs. Utting said only, watching Avis pack fish, "You are a loud weather girl, same as the rest of us." A fish-house woman said, kindlier than knives, that it was a comfort the poor soul had company. Avis carried the parted strand of the Collier's line in her apron that fortnight, and could not have said which argument it belonged to, the one about the dog, or the one about herself. He told her on a dead calm Sunday, at her own table, with the dog asleep on his boots, because he could not take one more week of her teaching, while she did not know whose debts she was paying. "I have let you believe I chose Marram Staithe off a chart," the Duke said. "I did not. The gentleman your husband died bringing off the Speedwell was my brother." The room was quiet. The fire moved. The dog slept on. "I know," said Avis. He had prepared for tears, for anger, for the door, not for that. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and when she looked up her face had the stillness of a person setting down a load carried so long it had grown into the shoulder. "I have known since the first week," she said. "You have told me the truth, and it has cost you, and so you will hear mine. Nobody has ever heard the whole of it. Sit still and let me say it in order, or I will lose my nerve." He sat still. She said it in order. "You have believed these 3 years that the thing failed your brother, that it was tried on him and came up short, a line that never truly reached him, tackle not good enough, powder not dry enough. It is why you buy guns. You have never once been able to ask the question out loud in this village, and I have never once been able to answer it, and so you have gone on believing it. It is false. There was a gun on this beach that night, borrowed out of Yarmouth, and gone back to Yarmouth since. No soul here has spoken of it to you, because no soul here knows you have a brother in it, and the men aboard who saw the rest of that night scattered up the coast inside the week, and not one of them was going to carry such news to a duke. The gun fell short, twice, with the wind in our teeth the way it stood on Tuesday. So Titus put the toggle in the dog's mouth and said, 'Go,' and Neptune went, through the surf, in the dark, out to a ship nobody on the shingle could see, and put that shot line into a sailor's hands over her rail. Her people hauled out the block and the hawser and the cot, and rigged her aloft, and she held. Every seaman aboard came ashore on it, out of the black and into my hands. I counted them onto the shingle. 9 men. The apparatus worked, Your Grace. It worked all night. The Duke had gone very white. She did not stop. Your brother would not get into the cot. He was left to the last, because a ship's people put a passenger's business behind their own once they have seen the state of him, and they had seen it. He stood with both hands on the rail and the cot swinging a yard off him, and could not step out over the water. It happens. I have seen it in grown seamen. Fear of that kind is a sea of its own, and he was drowning in it before he ever touched water. They could not force him and would not leave him, and she was opening under them by then. So Titus went out to him, along the hawser, hand over hand above the sea in a strop, to fetch him across by main strength, because there was nobody else and no time left. And he reached him. He got him off the rail and into the strop with him, and the two of them were coming, and we had their weight in our hands. And a sea came, the one sea, the one they always tell you about and you never believe until you are looking at it. And it took them together, a half cable from the shore, before we could haul. From where I stood I saw the rope come up empty. That is how the two men died. It reached him, Your Grace. It saved every other soul aboard her. The line worked. Terror held the last man, and Titus went to him. The Duke said nothing at all. His stillness had stopped being a manner and become a man holding on. The dog was still aboard her, she said, and her voice, which had stayed flat and orderly through all of it, moved at last. He had delivered his line, and a sailor had a fist in his harness, and he stayed in the lee of the rail through the whole night's traffic, so he was aboard to see Titus come out along the hawser. And when the sea took the two of them, Neptune went in off the wreck's own deck after his man. Nobody sent him. He quartered that water in the dark, up and down, and came into the beach, and turned and went out again, and I stood in the breakers to my waist, and I hauled him out of the sea by his harness. It is the only time in his life I ever used it against him. He was my husband's from a whelp, and he was the last thing my husband spoke to. Go was the last word Titus ever said, and it was said to the dog. The dog obeyed it and lived. The man who said it stayed and died. And I have had 3 years to decide what I think of a word that works like that, and decided nothing, except that no living voice will spend it while I stand on this shore. There is a paper about that night in Yarmouth, and I should think a copy reached your house. It says the final transfer failed and 2 men were lost. That is the whole of it. The crew set their marks to it, and I let it stand, and every soul here let it stand, because the only thing wanting out of it is a frightened man's last quarter of an hour, and there is no telling of that which does not make a public scandal of him. He is a gentleman drowned in a wreck. Let him be that. Out of the quiet the Duke said, in a voice stripped of every grace it usually wore, 3 years I have believed the thing was tried on my brother, and came up short. I built my whole penance on it. Guns, cordage, drills, 3 coasts. I thought, if there had only been better gear on that beach. He stopped and made himself finish. There was gear enough on that beach. What failed was nerve at one end of the rope, and at the other end, nothing failed at all. Nothing failed at all, said Avis. The bravest thing on that beach did every part of his work, twice, and was hauled out of the sea by a woman for wanting to do it a 3rd time. And I retired him. I told the village he had done his share. It was never his share I was measuring, Your Grace. I could not watch the sea take the last of what go had been said to, so I called it love, and I hung up his harness, and he has argued with me at every bell for 3 winters, and I let the parish tell the kind half of that night, and bury the rest, and would do it again tomorrow for any man's brother. You have now heard everything I know. They sat, the 3 of them, while the light went. When the Duke rose at last, he stopped at the door a moment, said nothing more, and went out into the dusk. Avis stood at the window a long time after, her hand finding the dome of the dog's head without her sending it, while the sea, far out, began to speak in the dark. The chart was spread in the gun shed some days later, weighted with round shot. The bar, the reef beyond the point, the killing grounds of that shore in Ollard's exact artillery hand. They were planning the winter's worst case, a ship on the outer reef, beyond the gun's best throw, in weather to shred a line. The captains stood round the table, Avis among them, called there as what she now was, the shore's other commanding officer. It was Ollard who said it, because counting every asset honestly was his trade, and he did it without cruelty. Beyond 300 yards in a gale, the gun is spent. A boat cannot live on the reef at all. Cromer's men will tell you the same. Which leaves what it has always left on every shore since rope was made. He looked at nobody in particular. There is one line dog alive on this coast, and every man at this table knows it. The shed went silent, and every eye, one pair after another, found the widow at the end of the table. What they were asking was reasonable. There was not a court in arithmetic that would convict them. The Duke rolled the chart up. "Then we find another way," he said. He said it with the finality of a man shutting a door, and turned to Allard. "Your count of yards again, Sergeant. If the gun cannot reach the reef from the beach, we will take the gun to the reef. A second piece, a lighter one, carried out along the point at need. Cost it for me by Friday." "It can be costed," said Allard, and glanced once at the widow at the end of the table, and his face stayed exactly where it was. The meeting moved on because the Duke moved it on, and never came back to the dog, because he had made it a place the meeting could not go. Avis sat through the rest of it in silence, but Neptune, lying by the shed door among the captain's boots, got up in the middle of the Duke's talk of carriage weights, crossed the shed, and lay down on the Duke's boots, and sighed and slept. Avis looked at the dog a long moment, then at the man, who had just, in one sentence, priced her dearest thing above 22 lives and his own salvation, and had no intention of ever mentioning it. There are turns a heart makes that no bell rings for. She walked home in the last of the light, with the parted strand in her apron, knowing at last which argument it belonged to, and it was neither of the two she had thought. The brig came at midday, in a full gale, before anyone was ready. She was Dutch, the Hendrika, out of Rotterdam for Hull, and struck the outer reef beyond the point with all her company alive, 22 souls, 320 yards off the shingle, the sea breaking white across her waist within the hour. The wreck bell went hard and fast, and Marram Staithe emptied onto the beach into a wind that stood men up at an angle, under the strange silver of storm noon, the sea white to the horizon. In the cottage, Neptune had the harness at the door before Avis had her cloak pinned. He dragged it to her feet by its strap and stood over it, and when she said, "Not you," he did a thing 3 winters had never produced. He stayed standing, ears up, the bell hammering, and only when she was at the door itself did he lie down at last, slowly, his eyes on her all the way down. She ran for the beach with that image stuck in her, and the dog shut in behind her. The gun was already going out, Allard's crew at a dead run with the wagon, and the short road to the point ran under the cliff, where the sea was coming over it green. A breaker took the wagon broadside on that run. It did not upset them. It went over the bed and into the powder chest, and when Allard got the lid, up the parish's whole store was a wet black sludge. He said one word, then opened the case he had carried on his own hip these 3 coasts, and set out 3 cartridges in waxed paper. 3, Your Grace, he said. 3 is what there is. The machine had 4 pieces, and the beach knew everyone. First, the shot line had to reach the ship. Then her people hauled the hauling line out by it, and the hawser by the hauling line, and made the hawser fast aloft. Only then could the cot travel. 4 pieces, each dependent on the one before, and the first lay at the raw limit of the gun's reach on a kind day, and this day was unkind. "Wind full in her teeth," said Allard at the breach, laying the gun. "I'll be robbed of 30 yards and more. Stand clear, fire." Shot 1 rose into the gale, and the gale ate it. 30 yards and more, as promised, stripped clean. The line dropped short, the sea flicked it away, and the beach groaned as one. "Fresh line." Allard was already turning. "Number 2 frame forward. I'll spend the wind's 30 and 10 of my own. Move, my sons, she is opening." Shot 2 carried true, and every soul on the beach saw the line go over the wreck, and then the laid line fouled in its frame, one buried turn biting on the next, and the flying line snapped taut against its own tangle, and parted with a crack like the mast going. A line must lie loose in its frame, every turn free of the next, or the shot tears it. They had drilled it 100 times. The sea had waited all winter for the one frame that lied. "Last cartridge," said Allard, and said it again, quietly to the Duke, because command was owed it. "Your Grace, that is the last dry cartridge on this beach." The last cartridge had come dry out of the sergeant's own case, and it went to the vent a shade too slow through the smother of spray, and the sea got its fee. The gun fizzled, sputtered, and lobbed the line a pitiful 80 yards. Powder and match must stay dry, and on that beach, in that wind, dry had run out. There was one shot line left on the beach, laid and ready in its frame, with a gun that could throw it into the sea and no farther. "Can a yawl live out there?" someone asked, down the line. "No," said 3 boatmen at once, flat, final. "Cromer?" "Cromer is 4 hours in this. She has 2, and she may have 3. That was the arithmetic, run out loud to its end, which was nothing. A man swimming that line was a dead man before the second bar, and everyone knew it, and nobody said anything more, which was when a sound went through the crowd from its landward edge, not a cheer, something lower, and it came apart to let a shape through. The cottage door had been shut. The wash-house window stood open on its peg, as it had stood every day of his life, and he was 7 years old and knew his own beach. Neptune came down the shingle through the parted crowd at a working trot, went to the last faking frame, picked up the toggle of the shot line, and walked into the sea. Avis got to him in the backwash before the second wave, down on both knees in the freezing run of it, her hands buried in the soaked rough, and stopped him, and he let her stop him, and he stood there in the surf's dragging edge with the toggle in his mouth. "And for the first time in 3 years," she asked. She put her face level with the great head and read him with her teacher's eyes, and not her widow's, the reading Titus had taught her before anything else. The dog was trembling, a fine deep tremor the cold alone did not account for, and he kept looking at the wreck, his eyes going past her shoulder to the breaking ship, and coming back to her, and going out again. And her hands went where they had gone before every launch of 3 winters, the ribs, his breathing already settling from the shingle run, the shoulder worked once and coming free, the eyes clear, the gait even when she turned him in the wash. 7 years old and sound. She was not deciding this about a broken dog. The Duke had reached her. She spoke without turning, half to him, half to the gale, in the voice of a woman reading a document she had refused 3 years to open. "He is trembling. Feel him. He swam that water, and it took his man, and his body remembers every yard of it, and he keeps looking at the wreck, trembling and looking, both at once. Do you understand what I am telling you? He is not fearless. He is willing, and I have spent 3 winters refusing to learn the difference. Not fearless, willing." "Charlie," she said, "the harness. Run." The boy went up the shingle at a dead run and came back with the old leather and brass in his arms, and the village understood and went quiet and strung itself along the shore in a long working line, hands already on the rope. She clipped him in before all of them, her fingers going to each strap in the old order without one fumble, chest, girth, breast strap, and the brass ring at his shoulders that a hand could get into over a ship's rail. Nothing was made fast to him. It never had been. She spoke while she worked, loudly enough for the Duke at her shoulder, and let the wind carry the rest. "I set his share for him 3 winters ago, and I called it love, and it was fear wearing love's coat. I am done setting it. Ask him." Her hands finished. "I have asked him. You saw his answer walk down this beach." She stood and gave the Duke the shore end and her rules with it, in the voice she used over rope, that had never once been argued with. "The line is in his mouth, not on his body. He can put it down whenever he likes, and if he does and turns back, you haul it home and say nothing, and there is no shame in him, and none in you. Do not haul while he has hold of it, not 1 yard, or you pull it out of him. If I say haul, you haul. If he fouls in it and it takes him under, you cut, and you do not stop to ask me. And if he reaches them, said the Duke, then 22 people learn why I spent 3 years pretending that dog was finished. There remained the word. It had lived in her mouth, locked, 3 winters. It was go, and it was a dead man's, and the dog stood in his harness at the sea's edge waiting. She knelt once more at the great head. That word isn't yours either, she said aloud to herself, and the village heard it and made nothing of it, and the Duke heard it and made everything. Then she stood clear of her dog, and her right hand came up and went forward, low and flat, out over the water, Titus's own signal, used before he ever used a word, and this dog had answered it 100 times on this shore. The hand was for the dog. What she filled her lungs with and sent after it down the gale was for herself, and it was not go, and it was not finished. Again! Neptune went into the sea without ceremony and without one wasted motion. He took the first breaker shoulder on, punched through the white of it, and was swimming. The great webbed engine of him settled into the working stroke, head high, the toggle in his teeth, the shot line paying out behind him in long singing pulls. 400 people and 1 Duke watched a black head go out through a white sea. The Duke stood at the shore end with the line running live through his hands and did his work and learned in the doing every word she had said to him. Give him slack, more. He's under a sea, wait for him. Avis stood at his shoulder, reading the water for the pair of them. There, swimming, take up your 2 yards. Sea coming on his left hand, let it carry him, don't fight it. Now take up. Good, you are doing it, your grace. Breathe. Is that an order? Everything I say on this beach is an order. And between them the shore end held its nerve, yard upon yard upon yard. It was long, 300 yards and better of broken winter sea, and the black head shrank until only its steadiness told them it lived, gone in each trough, up on each shoulder of white water, swimming. Twice a sea shoved him yards aslant, and twice the head came round, and the stroke resumed. Still swimming, an old boatman said down the line, to nobody, his cap in his hands. Still swimming. I cannot see him, said the Duke once. Feel the line, said Avis. The line can. Then the line stopped running. It hung slack in the Duke's hands, and the beach stopped breathing. And then it pulled. Once, twice, hard. The signal every soul there had been taught at drill. Line delivered, haul away. The dog had reached the Hendrika. A sailor's arm had him. They saw it in the glass, a fist locked in the old harness, hauling him half aboard into the lee of the rail, out of the worst of it, while the crew took the shot line off the toggle and began the desperate, blessed work of hauling out what came behind it, the tail block, and behind the block a plank of varnished deal. Dutch hands turned it into the light and read it in 3 seconds. No English crossed the sea. 6 pictures did. The machine turned over at last, all its parts in one motion, shot line, hauling line, hawser swayed out through the surf, tail block made fast to the mainmast stump, by men who had never seen the apparatus and rigged it right, a dog standing dripping beside them. Cots away! It came back loaded. A boy of 16 and a ship's carpenter with a broken hand swung high over the breakers into the arms of the shore crew, alive. After that it was work, the purest work that beach ever did. The cot took 2 light men at a time, and once 3 because 2 were boys, so what should have been 22 crossings was 11. Handsomely. Next pair, haul! The shore crew moving to Avis's count, and Mrs. Utting first up the shingle with dry blankets, commanding by trade and not title. Set him down by the fire-cart. You, sir. Yes, you, my lord. Your greatcoat. Off, that boy is 16. Warm them slow. The storm silver went out of the light while they worked and left it low and yellow. 10 crossings and 21 men on the shingle, and on the wreck 1 figure remaining, and the rope's traffic stopped. Captain Hendricks would not get into the cot. They could see him at the rail, a broad, white-bearded figure lashed to his own ship, waving the cot off, sending it back empty. The master's old law, last off or never, and his brig was dying under him, and he had decided to be finished when she was. Neptune had been held aboard through the traffic, resting in the crook of the rail. When the cot went back empty the second time, the shore saw the black shape come loose of the sailor's grip, cross the tilted deck to the master, and shove his head against the old man, hard, herding fashion. The captain pushed him off and pointed him at the cot. The dog came back and shoved again. Shove, return, shove, return. 140 pounds of patient argument, wet and immovable, and the beach could see the captain shouting at him, and the dog taking it placidly and going nowhere. "What is he doing?" said the Duke. "What in the name of heaven is he doing?" "What he was taught," said Avis. Her voice had gone strange and bright. "That deck is in the sea, Your Grace, and there is a man standing on it. In all the years my husband had him, he never once let him leave a man in the water. Not in drill, not in play, not ever. That captain may shout in Dutch till the tide turns. The dog will stand there until one of them gives way, and it will not be the dog." "Stubborn, bloody animal," said the Duke, his throat sanded raw. "Which one?" said Avis. "Both." In the end, the last two came across together, in the same cot, there being no other crossing to come. Captain Hendricks clipped himself in slowly, taking his time over every buckle, because the dog would not abandon him, and he had grasped what that would cost. Then, being in, he got both arms under 140 pounds of wet Newfoundland and hauled him aboard by the harness, across his knees, and held him there. The 11th crossing came in over the surf with a master mariner and a dog in it, and the beach made a noise half cheer and half weeping. They lifted him out at the shingle and set him on his feet. He stood a moment, spent, the sea's weight in his coat, and came straight through the reaching, sobbing, blessing crowd, past every hand, as he had come on a quieter morning a winter ago, to Avis, and pressed his head into her stomach, and leaned there, breathing, while her hands went over every inch of him and found him whole. Then he turned his head, his brow still against her, and looked for the Duke. The Duke came, and the dog lay down at last on the streaming shingle between the two of them, one flank on the Duke's boots and his head on hers, and everything there was to say stood in that one arrangement, wanting nothing but a fire. Captain Hendricks stood before Avis with the sea running off him, and said something in Dutch, and then in English gravely. "Your dog does not hear my language. It did not matter. There are things said without any words at all. He said one to me. The Staithe woke famous, the gale blown out overnight. 22 Dutch seamen quartered on the village. Gentry from 3 parishes, Mrs. Utting at the head of the shingle rationing the gratitude by the ladleful. You may look at the gun, she told a baronet's party, and you may give your shillings to the Dutch boys who came ashore in their shirts. The dog is asleep, and will be asleep all this week, and if one of you wakes him you will answer to me, and then to the widow, and you would prefer me." Captain Hendricks stood a long time that morning looking at the reef, and the dark line at low water left of his command. Then he stopped by Avis at her gate, and gave her the one thing he had left to give, which was the name. "Hendrika," he said, "my son's daughter. 7 years old in Rotterdam. I christened the brig for her the week she was born." He looked down at the great black shape sleeping across the doorway in the sun. "A man does not leave his granddaughter while she is dying. This is not seamanship, I know it. I know only that he leaned on my legs until I chose to live. You will permit me to send him a herring barrel every year I am spared." It was Charlie who put the other thing right, without knowing. He came up the path with his rope in his hand, and the dog raised his head, and the boy said, "Hello, Neptune." His name had never gone out of that cottage. Avis said it a dozen times a day, but no child in Marram Staithe had ever said it the way the boy said it. offhand in the present tense, to a dog standing right there, with no memorial wrapped round it anywhere. "Say that again," said Avis at the door. "Hello, Neptune," said Charlie, uncertain what he had done. "Nothing. Come in. He has been waiting for you," she said, and had to be busy at the fire a while. She cleaned the harness that week, saddle soap and wax, every buckle, every strap, and hung it on its peg by the door, supple and ready and no relic. There is a difference between a shrine and a peg, and she had learned it the hard way. The Duke came on the Friday with a proposal, and was made to revise it. He came with papers fully drawn, a coastal rescue establishment at Marram Staithe, a kennel for the breeding and training of line dogs, a permanent gun crew, the Cubitt system of shore drill its founding method. He laid it on her table, shy and magnificent at once, and she read all 14 pages and told him what was wrong with it. "Every line of this is yours," she said. "Your funds, your trustees, your name across the head of it, and I am to direct it at your pleasure. If every answer begins with your purse, you will own every answer by accident. You are a good man, and it would happen anyway. It is what a purse is for." "Then draw it as you would have it," said the Duke, and sat down at her table and took up her pen. "A committee," said Avis, "of this village, boatmen and fish-house women who know what the sea is, sitting above your trustees, who know what money is. Written. The accounts published on the church door, quarterly, every shilling, where Dunning's wife can read them. Written. And my post, mistress of the kennel and of shore drill, salaried under the charter, the salary and the authority secured to my separate use, in law in ink, beyond the reach of any husband I might ever take. Have your solicitor say it so, a court would bow to it." "And Mrs. Utting on the committee," said the Duke. "Attending it," said Mrs. Utting, who had brought the tea and stayed. "Chairing is for them as like voting. I shall simply be right." The Duke's pen paused over the separate use clause, and then wrote it, all of it, and it was executed within the month, Allard witnessing with artillery solemnity. The first 2 young dogs came in March, from a Lynn shipmaster newly returned from Newfoundland, who had heard the story. Leggy, hopeless, magnificent puppies. They lived in the yard and watched the old dog and did what he did. The sea was a thing one entered shoulder first, and a rope the most interesting object in the world. Neptune tolerated them with weary grandeur, and took their bread. The romance, when it had room, took no dramatic shape at all, and the village, following it with 400 pairs of eyes, was delighted by everything. Whatever poetry was in him, he had learned where to spend it, on being exactly on time, twice a week, in all weathers, and arguing drainage with her on the tide line on Sundays in front of everybody. Picture 1. The kennel yard gate at dusk. The ears lesson his now. Freely, without wage or bargain, the 2 of them on the rail while the young dogs tumbled and the old dog lay in the last warm of the wall, ears turning. "Left ear," said the Duke, unprompted. "The fish cart by the church." And Avis looked at him a moment with her heart in her face, because being learned from is one thing, and being learned is another. Picture 2. Her kitchen, a Thursday, rain on the glass. He read the kennel accounts aloud. She mended a girth. 3 shillings out. Then we have our evening's entertainment. Neptune slept across the Duke's boots in the firelight, an arrangement all 3 had stopped remarking. At the door, leaving, the Duke did up his coat slowly, from the bottom, to make the leaving last, and her smile at the buttons was answer enough. It moved at a cargo's pace, and it arrived. He asked her, on an ordinary calm morning in October, over the remains of breakfast, while the dog lay asleep in the 1 bar of sunlight on the floor, and ignored the entire proceeding. He asked it standing, since everything of importance between them had been transacted standing, at the 2 ends of a rope. Titus's coat hung on its hook by the door, where it had hung all along and would go on hanging. The Duke had seen it every visit for a year. He looked at it once that morning, and looked away, and asked it to move exactly as much as he ever had, which was not at all, and that, she said afterwards, was why the thing was possible at all. "I have a question," he said, "and I have been advised by everyone from Ollard to the sexton to dress it up, and I find I can't. You know what my life is. You know what yours is. I am asking you to bring yours and marry me." Avis looked at him for a while. Then she looked at the dog, flat in his bar of sun, one ear inside out, deeply and insultingly asleep. "You'll notice he has nothing to say about it," she said. "He has views on everything else in my kitchen." "I noticed," said the Duke. "I take it for the only character I will ever need. He worked last time. This one is yours." The sentence sat in the warm room and became the proposal entire. Every wreck, every rope, every winter of it in 8 words, the task laid where it belonged, in her 2 hands at the shore end. She looked at the coat on its hook, which had nothing to fear from this man, at the harness on its peg, cleaned and oiled for work, at the sleeping dog. "Why?" she said. "Say the true reason. You are able to." "Because I have spent months trying to deserve a task he could not do for me," said the Duke. "There is no rope from my shore to yours. It has to be asked for. I am asking." "Yes," said Avis, plain in the flat voice she saved for truths. And then, because it was hers now and had never been before, Ludovic. The dog slept on. The kettle came to the boil with a domestic shriek, and that was how the Duke of Blakeney became engaged, standing in a fish widow's kitchen with a tea-cloth, laughing, with nobody to see him but a retired hero who declined to wake. She gave him her terms that morning, counted off on her fingers, and he heard them with the attention he gave hall rules, which was the correct classification. First, the dog belongs to himself first, and me second, and to the establishment third, and to you nowhere. He had one master, and the sea took him. What Neptune gives now, he gives. That is the law of him, and it will be respected in my house. Agreed. Second, there will be prints. There are prints already. A man in Norwich has him hauling a lifeboat, of all things, with the sky wrong. I cannot stop Norwich. I can stop us. No print commissioned, endorsed or licensed by you or the establishment uses him without my consent, and my consent will be rare, and the profit goes to the committee when I give it. Agreed with pleasure. The sky was wrong in 3 particulars. You bought one. I bought 4. They are in a locked drawer, and the key is at the bottom of my moat, which is a very wet ditch with ambitions. Third, if we are given children, no child of ours is ever required to like the sea. Loving the work cannot be an inheritance. It has to be asked for, each soul separately. If a child of yours prefers barley to boats, that child will be the happiest farmer in Norfolk, and no eyebrow in my house will move." "Agreed," said the Duke. He was quiet a moment. "My brother never liked the sea. Nobody asked him, either. It was simply the family's element, and he was the family." He put his hand flat on the table. "Agreed twice over. Last." She put her fingers down and looked at him straight. "You are a protecting man. It is the best and the most dangerous thing in you. So, the day will come when you cannot tell whether you are protecting me from danger or protecting me from choosing. On that day you will ask me which it is, out loud, and take my answer. That is the term the rest stand on. My first husband did not need it said. You do a little. There is no shame in that, but there is no waiver of it either." The Duke took his time with that one, which she counted in his favour. "Agreed. And one of my own. The accounts stay published on the church door every quarter, even when the committee is family, especially then." "Done," said Avis, and they shook hands across the breakfast table, 2 masters agreeing a charter, which is what it was. The kiss came later that day, and not at the table. It was at the tide line, in the low, bright winter sun. She stopped him with a hand flat on his chest, considered him with her head a little to one side, in exactly the manner she considered weather, and then took hold of the lapels of his greatcoat with both hands and kissed him thoroughly for a long time, while the sea, for once in its life, held its opinion. The Duke, when he was released, had to recover his hat. Neptune had walked on 20 yards ahead. He glanced back once and lay down on the cold shingle to wait, chin on his paws, his face up the beach. "A wet-weather post only, it seems," said Avis, against the Duke's collar. They were married in January, in the wreck season, on purpose. "Nobody sensible," said the eldest of the Duke's aunts, "marries on that coast in January." "This family holds its festivals where its work is," said Avis, and the aunts, who had been told about her and were beginning to see that the telling had been accurate, retired from the field. It was small and bright. Marram Staithe Church, whitewashed and candle-warm on a clean cold morning. Coral silk, deep and glowing, the tawny hair up under winter roses. The Duke in blue so dark it was nearly the sea's own colour, unable to stop looking at her and making no effort to be able. Ollard stood up in full artillery best and wept at the exact attention. "Powder smoke," he said, to nobody who had asked. Mrs. Utting came early and stood a moment on the church step, facing the water. "Behave," she told it. "One day. You owe this house that much. And going in, and mind you send no weather before the cake." The village came entire, and its gifts were its own. A coil of best Riga rope from the boatmen, a herring barrel, the first of an annual tribute, with a letter in careful Dutch-schooled English, and from Dunning a speech at the wedding breakfast. "I'll say the plain thing," said Dunning on his feet, glass up, the arm long mended. "When my wing was broke, the wages came doubled every week of it, and my wife never knew a thin Friday. That was him, before ever he was ours, and her rules are why the Collier's company and 22 Dutchmen have their feet under tables tonight. So here is the bride, and here is the groom, and here is the year, the mad glorious length of it. Stand up, the lot of you. You know what we owe." And it was drunk standing. Neptune attended at the church door, washed to a black shine, and was patient about all of it. When the couple came out into the cold sunshine, he fell in between them, at heel where the path was wide and ahead where it was not, and escorted them down through the cheering village, and the bells, church bells this once, with no wreck in them, rang behind the three of them all along the tide line. 4 winters on, the kennel yard at Marram Staithe had lamplight in it most evenings, and the establishment's founding officer had a grey muzzle. He was 11 that winter, and carried his age with dignity. Stiff in the hips on cold mornings, cloudy in one eye, still first to the gate when the fish cart came. 3 young dogs held the working roster, 2 of Lynn blood and 1 of his own get, black as the sire, the same white blaze at the chest. And the youngest of their handlers was Charlie, 13 now, his 10-minute lessons grown into a calling. The bell went on a howling night in December, hard strokes, a ship on the bar, and the yard came alive, lanterns, running feet, the gun wagon's team stamping, the young dogs at the gate with their ears up, bred for this hour, frantic at it. By the bench at the wall, the old dog started to rise. He got his forequarters up, hips gathering for the heave, head already turned to the gate, to the bell, to the sea, and Avis, Duchess of Blakeney, in a working cloak of deep coral with the lantern light in her face, put her hand on his shoulder, not restraining, just there. He stood a moment under her hand, trembling faintly, looking at the gate. The young dogs went, a rush of black shapes and swinging lanterns, Charlie's voice calling his own dog's word, out into the weather, gone. The gate banged, and the old dog lowered himself. Slowly, joint by joint, with all his years in it, he let the rising go and settled back down, and put his chin on his paws, facing the door, where he could hear it all, and stayed. Mrs. Utting was in the lamplight by the kennel kitchen, past 70 now, attending every launch as a matter of parish government. Somebody must mind the sea's manners. was her stated office. She watched the old dog lower himself, and her quick dark eyes went wet, and she asked the question every soul who has loved a working creature asks at that gate and dreads the answer to. Does it hurt him? Avis's hand was still on the black shoulder. She could feel the trembling ease, the ears standing to the storm, the far-off shore crew voices, the gun's distant thump, every note of the work going on without him. I think it hurts, she said. I also think he is proud. Ah, said Mrs. Utting. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, businesslike. Then it is with dogs as it is with the rest of us, and I shall stop hoping otherwise. The Duke came out of the dark in his oilskins, on his way to the shore end with the second crew, and stopped. His hand came to rest on the old dog's shoulder beside his wife's, the two hands together in the black fur, and Neptune shifted his weight against the Duke's boot and sighed, and Avis laughed at him softly through whatever else was in her face. He has decided you belong here, she said. Dogs are less vain than we are about the distinction. Then the Duke went down to his rope, and the Duchess stood in the lamplit gate with her hand on her old dog, listening to the young ones work the sea. The bell rang again, and this time the old dog let somebody else answer it. And that is the story of Neptune of Marram Staithe, of Avis, who learned to ask, of Ludovic, Duke of Blakeney, who learned what a rope cannot carry, and of one old black dog who answered for himself, in front of everybody. If this story warmed you, friends, do an old dog a kindness and press the like, and subscribe if you would care to hear another by our fire. And tell us true down in the comments, who in your family, two-footed or four, still wanted a place in the work after everybody else thought the work was done? And how did you know when the answer finally changed? We read every comment. Until next time, remember Neptune of Marram Staithe, who dragged his harness to the door at every bell for 3 winters and was right. Good night, friends.